We take that to schools, to parishes, any place we can to, again, witness to sacred human life. We carry out our mission to help the community understand the life issues through our media, through our quarterly newsletter, through our website, which we're developing more and more as a resource for information, through our email, through our social media. Now we're at 20 social media platforms. You can find us on any social media. And finally, we have a political outreach as well. So we'll be sending out a survey to all these political candidates coming up in the spring election to identify specifically where they are on the life issues. If across the board they recognize sacred human life in any circumstance without exception, we will notify you and notify our membership about their pro-life position. So you know who to vote for: pro-family, pro-life, pro-conservative, pro-God political candidates. And then we support their legislation. We've got, as you know, great promise, great hope this year. We expect Roe v. Wade to be overturned in June. We've all got to be active in LB 933, the trigger bill that will make abortion, medical and surgical, illegal in Nebraska if that trigger law goes into effect. This is not the time to sit back and watch it happen. For decades, we've been praying, we've been witnessing, haven't we, Joe? We've been witnessing at the abortion mills. We've been asking God to help us. We've been begging for his intercession. People far and wide have been compassionately reaching out to these mothers who've been deceived into thinking that they can kill their own child. All these years, all this blood, sweat, and tears, all these prayers really are coming down to this coming year where we're going to see Roe v. Wade overturned. We're going to see that Nebraska trigger bill enacted with your help. As you witness to your friends, take your friends with you, go down and testify at these hearings, contact your representatives, contact your state legislatures, and make sure that they're representing life. And then witness to your friends and your neighbors, as I said. This is the time to tell others about this great truths of the sanctity of human life. And if they don't listen, we'll shake the dust and go on to somebody who will. So please visit nebraskansembracinglife.org, where you can understand our mission. That's what we're doing. That's what we're all about, with your support, especially with your prayer, with your volunteer work. We've got over 200 volunteers supporting us, and we need your help in monetary donation if you're able. And again, invite the youth, invite friends. We've got to reach out to others to really be a witness to others about these sacred holy truths that we hold dear. I want you to know that it's one of the great honors to introduce so many good pro-life speakers that we have. But Stephen Mosher is exceptional, as you know. For decades, he's been witnessing some of these same truths that I've mentioned in exposing the evils of population control to the whole global community in a way that really helps us to see clearly who we are and see what the evil one is up to, and leading us to death through these awful, tyrannical, Marxist, governmental, political bodies that only want to impose death on us. Stephen Mosher is an internationally recognized authority on China and population issues, as well as an acclaimed author and speaker. He has worked tirelessly since 1979 to fight coercive population control programs and has helped hundreds of thousands of women and families worldwide over the years. In 1979, Stephen was the first American social scientist to visit mainland China. He was invited there by the Chinese government, where he had access to government documents and actually witnessed women being forced to have abortions under the new one-child policy. Some abortions he witnessed were late term. Mr. Mosher was a pro-choice atheist at the time, but witnessing these traumatic abortions led him to reconsider his convictions and to eventually become a practicing pro-life Roman Catholic. Stephen has appeared numerous times before Congress as an expert in world population, China, and human rights abuses. He has also made TV appearances on Good Morning America, 60 Minutes, The Today Show, 2020, Fox, and CNN News, as well as being a regular guest on talk show radio shows across the nation. He's also author of a best-selling A Mother's Ordeal, a one-woman's fight against China's one-child policy, which Stephen exposed to the world. Other books include Hegemon, China's plan to dominate Asia and the world. China attacks, China misperceived. American illusions and Chinese reality. Journey to the Forbidden China, Broken Earth. The Rural Chinese, and his most recent book, Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the New Threat to World Order. Please welcome the president of the Population Research Institute, Stephen Mosher.
Thank you, David. It's good to be here in Nebraska, and thank you for arranging this warm weather for me. I'm not kidding. In northern Kentucky a couple days ago, it was 1 degree. And since my wife and I have been living in Florida for the last couple of years, that was quite a shock to our system. But we were buoyed by the fact that my son, who's living with us and going to law school, Ave Maria Law School down in Ave Maria, Florida, called us tonight and told us that tonight's low was going to be the annual low. It was going to get down to 33 degrees. So you see, I don't feel quite so bad about being here. So I'm going to date myself by telling you that during the Vietnam War, I was an officer in the U.S. Navy and with the Pacific Fleet. And at the end of my time of service, by that time, I'd become interested in China. And so I resigned my commission and I went to Hong Kong, which was then a free city, unlike the present situation where it has been brought under the misrule of the Chinese Communist Party directly. I went to the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I learned to speak, read, and write Chinese. In fact, I speak three Chinese languages, Mandarin, Cantonese, and Taiwanese, because I did my doctoral dissertation research on Taiwan a couple of years later. I then went to Stanford, and China was just on the cusp of opening up at that time. On January 15th of 1979, we established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. We had not had diplomatic relations with that country, with that government, until then. From the time that the Communist Revolution had succeeded in 1949 until 1979, China was behind a kind of bamboo curtain. We didn't know much about what was going on behind that bamboo curtain except what the party chose to tell us. And of course, what the party chose to tell us was only the good things that were happening in China, supposedly, and not the darker side. So, diplomatic relations. On January 15th, 1979, I was selected by the National Security Council to be the first American social scientist on the ground in China. They selected me because I could read, write, and speak Chinese, and they thought that I would be able to ditch my minders, that is, the government officials who always accompany visitors in China to make sure they only see and hear and talk to people who espouse the party line. And I was. It took me a couple of weeks to get rid of them, but when I finally told them that I wasn't going to pay them because I didn't need translators, they left. That usually works. So I was alone in the village. Alone in the village. It was a commune at that time of 10,000 people, and I was able to talk freely with the people of China. And of course, in the evening, over a glass of rice wine, they would, after they came to know me, tell me horror stories about life under the party. They told me about the days when the Red Army first came to the commune and took out anybody associated with the old regime, anybody who'd been in the local militia, anybody who'd been a member of the Nationalist Party, took them out to a local hill called Turtle Hill and summarily executed them. They told me about the 1950s land reform, when anyone who owned a little land was declared a rich peasant or landlord and struggled and often killed. They told me about the Great Leap Forward, when they were forced into communal life, where kitchen utensils were destroyed so that people could not cook in their own kitchens. They had to eat in a communal mess hall, which some people thought was a great deal until you went to the communal mess hall and there was no food available in the communal mess hall. 42.5 million people starved to death as a result of that experiment in communism from 1960 to 1962. They took me out to the burial grounds outside the commune where hundreds of people, mostly the very old and the very young, were buried. They told me about the Cultural Revolution, when anyone who had an education, anyone who had any Western contacts, anyone who had people overseas, relatives overseas, anyone who had family ties with former nationalist officials was considered to be a black element and was struggled and punished for the sins of their fathers and mothers. And of course, when the one-child policy began, they immediately came over and told me what was happening. In fact, I remember very well the evening of March 8th, 1980, when the local Commune Party secretary, this was the leader of the Communist Party in this area, came over to my house in the evening. I had built a house in the village, waving a government document. And he said, Mao Sidi, which is my Chinese name. Chairman Mao and I share the same Chinese surname, but we're only related through Adam and Eve, I would imagine. So he came over and waving this document, he said, Mr. Mao, I thought you'd like to see this document. It's just come down from the Central Committee of Guangdong Province. And of course, I was interested in seeing all the government documents I could get my hands on. This one was particularly interesting because it said that the population of Canton Province, Guangdong Province, which is the province way in the south next to Hong Kong, was growing too fast and was already too large, and that it was a strain on China's resources, and that as a result, the leaders of the Communist Party in Guangdong Province had declared that the population was only going to be allowed to increase by 1% in the year 1980. Well, that's an extraordinary declaration if you think about it. I said, yes, well, that's very clear what your goal is, but how are you going to limit the population growth, which is the difference between the number of people who are born and the number of people who die, to 1% over the course of 1980? After all, it's already March. All the babies who are going to be born in 1980 have already been conceived. How are you going to do it? And this Communist Party official, I'll never forget, said, oh, it's very simple, Mr. Mao. We will simply go house to house, and we will identify all the women in the commune who are pregnant. And if they're pregnant with a second child or a third child or a fourth child, we will simply order them to get an abortion. Well, that's exactly what they did. They went door to door. They identified all the women who were pregnant with what they called illegal children. Women, of course, the women who were told they were carrying illegal children were very surprised to learn that the babies they had conceived 6 months before, legally, were now suddenly illegal. And they were told they must go in for an abortion. Some of them did, mostly the ones who were 2, 3, 4 months pregnant. Those who were further along, most of them said, no, we're not going to submit to an abortion. We've already felt the baby move in our wombs. Their husbands stood by their sides too. And at that point, things got really serious. Those women, and there were 18 in the particular village I was living in, were arrested for the crime of being pregnant. I have copies of the arrest warrants. What's the charge listed on the arrest warrant? What's the crime? The crime is being pregnant. They were taken to a local seat of government. They were locked up in a dormitory. They were given 2 bowls of, 2 meals of rice, one in the morning, one in the evening. And in between morning and evening, they were subjected to morning to night propaganda sessions, brainwashing sessions. We actually get the term brainwashing from the Chinese Communist Party. It was invented by the party in the 1930s. In Chinese, you say, 洗脑, wash brain. And literally that's what it is. You subject someone to so much psychological pressure and trauma that they finally have, as the Chinese say, no opinions at all. They just go along with whatever's being demanded of them because they just want it to be over. It's like the final scene in 1984 when Winston is asked how many fingers. He will see as many fingers or as few as the official wants him to see at that point, because his will to resist is broken. The will of these women who were arrested was eventually broken. It took, in some cases, a few weeks and a couple of months. None of those women gave birth. They were all aborted. The morning to night study sessions were a study in good cop, bad cop techniques. Because a bad cop would come in, and this would be a senior male party official, and he's talking to young, pregnant women. These are women in their early 20s, pregnant with a second and third child. And he would say, none of you has any choice. You will get an abortion whether you want one or not. Should you go into labor before you give us permission, we will simply take you by force to the abortion clinic, and your baby will be killed at birth. That's exactly what they did, by the way. There were cases of infanticide, there were cases of women who held out until they went into labor, and at that point, they were taken to the abortion clinic, and the doctors, and these weren't local doctors, by the way, these were Red Army doctors. These were doctors who were brought in from another province. These were doctors who were military doctors. They had no connections, no ties, and no sympathy for the local villagers. Local doctors wouldn't do this. So they brought in doctors from the outside. I shouldn't call them doctors, they were abortionists, they were butchers. They would wait, if a woman was in labor, they would wait for her to be almost ready to give birth. The baby's head would be crowning. And as the baby's head was crowning, they would take a hypodermic syringe, fill it with alcohol or formaldehyde, and inject it into the soft spot of the child's skull, the fontanelle. If the woman was taken in at 7, 8, 9 months before she went into labor, they would take a hypodermic needle and inject a poison into the unborn child, which had two effects. It would kill the baby within a day or two, and it would bring on uterine contractions. Sometimes the contractions didn't proceed fast enough, so the Red Army doctors invented a new procedure, hitherto unheard of, called a cesarean section abortion. They would perform a cesarean section on these women and remove the now dead or dying babies. I was present when this was going on. Now, I have to tell you that when I went to China, I remember I had been teaching at the University of California at Berkeley. I had been finishing a doctoral dissertation at Stanford University. I was looking forward to a tenure-track position and life as a professor. I was also at the same university, Stanford University, which was the home of none other than the original population bomber. Paul Ehrlich was a colleague of mine. Paul Ehrlich, the guy who wrote a book in 1968 called The Population Bomb, which predicted that the world was overpopulated, so much so that hundreds of millions of people, he told us, were going to starve to death in the 1970s. And when hundreds of millions of people didn't starve to death in the 1970s, he wrote another book saying that hundreds of millions of people would starve to death in the 1980s. And when they didn't starve to death in the 1980s, you get the picture. He's made a living off telling us that the world is overpopulated. He was a colleague of mine. I probably, when I went to China, also languished under the misapprehension that China's primary problem was too many people. But it wasn't, you see. China's primary problem then and now is an overbearing, corrupt government that imposed a one-child policy on the Chinese people. Now, I've told you how the policy was carried out. But what was its demographic effect? Well, we're talking about 10 to 20 million forced abortions every year, beginning in 1980 and going all the way to 2016. The one-child policy was in place, 36 years. Over the course of that time, we estimate that there were about 400 million forced abortions performed in China. That's 400 million people eliminated from China's population. That's 400 million tiny sons of Adam, daughters of Eve, who never drew their first breath. So that's an enormous human tragedy. And if you combine that 400 million with the 42 million who starved to death after the great leap forward in the early 60s, and the tens of millions who were killed in various political campaigns, the total deaths of people who were already born in China is probably close to 100 million. Take 100 million, add 400 million to that, that's a half a billion people. We're talking about real numbers. So the Chinese Communist Party, whatever else you can say about it, is probably the biggest killing machine in human history. It has eliminated more people from the planet than any other political organization ever. And what is the effect of eliminating 400 million of the most productive, enterprising, hardworking people on the face of the planet, on your country, on your society, on your economy? Well, think about it. That's half of the last 2 generations were extinguished in the womb. Now, it took a long time for the old men who run China to realize that they had made the classic blunder. They had eliminated the ultimate resource, the one resource that you cannot do without, the one unique resource, the one God-given resource that, because of that resource, it unlocks all the other resources that God prepositioned on the planet. And I'm talking about human beings. I'm talking about the creative intelligence that human beings are blessed with as a gift of God, which in turn, that intelligence in turn unlocks other resources on the planet. They had eliminated the ultimate resource. But it took them a long time to realize that, because in China, you don't criticize the government. It's a very dangerous thing to do for your health. And so year after year, 10 to 20 million babies were eliminated in utero. Millions of little girls were killed at birth as well by parents. Now, why would parents kill a healthy baby? 2 reasons. One is there is a strong preference for sons in China. The other is they were only allowed 1 child, and they were desperate that that child be a son, because in the 80s and 90s, and even today in rural China, there's no social support network, there's no social security to speak of. People rely upon their children for support in old age. And if you tell them they can only have 1 child, and given the preference for sons, some Chinese couples, not all, but some, decided that if they had a little girl, she was not going to be allowed to live. And then they would go to the officials and they'd say, our little daughter died, we want permission to have another child, and they would get permission to have another child. So millions of baby girls were eliminated in China. That's why today we have 30 million young men in China who will never be able to get married and find a bride, because the women they would have married were killed after birth, or in some cases by sex selection abortion before birth. I've testified before Congress and before many state legislatures against sex selection abortion, and we banned it in a number of states. We should ban all abortions, but particularly sex selection abortion is a heinous crime. It's the worst form of discrimination, of course. It's discrimination that kills. But back to the wanton destruction of human capital that was occurring in the one-child policy, and the fact that it took decades for China's leaders to realize that they'd made a terrible mistake. Their first clue came in 2016 when they had a labor shortage of 4 million workers. Why did they have a labor shortage? Well, they killed off the young people who would have entered the workforce. And so they decided, okay, maybe we've gone a little too far. Let's adopt, they said, a 2-child policy. 3 children will still be forbidden, and people will get in trouble if they have a 3rd child. But we'll allow everyone to have 2 children instead of 1. We'll be generous. Well, guess what? 35 years of anti-natal propaganda had done their work. Young people in China weren't interested in getting married or having children. And it didn't matter how many children the government said they should or could have. Birth rates in China, and this is from an article that's coming out in the New York Post on Sunday, which I'm giving you a sneak preview of. Birth rates in China are in free fall, and the all-powerful Communist Party of China seems powerless to do anything about it. Last year, only 10.62 million babies were born in China, down from 12 million in 2020. So the numbers of babies born in China are declining. That's the lowest number in Chinese history. Millennials are the problem. And actually, we shouldn't call them millennials. These are two generations of only children that resulted from the one-child policy. Think about the one-child policy over two generations, right? First generation has a father and a mother, no brothers and sisters, and 4 grandparents. But their father and their mother have brothers and sisters, so they have aunts and uncles and cousins. By the second generation, you've shorn away those branches from the family tree. 2 generations of only children. The second generation has a father and a mother. Father and mother have no brothers and sisters because they're only children as well. Many Chinese men in their 20s and early 30s seem to have simply given up on life right now. Unlike their fathers and grandfathers who worked hard, long hours, started business so they could buy an apartment, attract a wife, raise a family, these coddled only sons in China that we're seeing now have trouble getting out of bed in the morning. It's not just laziness, it's an entire way of life. They even have a name for themselves. They call themselves Tangpingers. And Tangping means to lay flat. And what that means is that they do as little as possible. Their plans don't include marriage, much less children. It's just too much work for the flat layers, or the lay flatters, or the Tangpingers, as you prefer. Of course, the Tangpingers would have a difficult time finding a bride in any case because they outnumber the women by so many millions. Competition for brides is fierce. Many young women in China's cities have taken themselves out of the marriage game altogether. They're focused on building careers, not marriages. You ask them about children and they say, we have to take care of 2 elderly parents. Why do we want children? Few members of either group will ever marry, much less have children, and together they number in the tens of millions. Now, communist officials will tell you today, because they never admit they've done anything wrong ever, that may sound like a typical political behavior, which it is, carried to an extreme in China, however. They continue to insist that China's population will stabilize at its present 1.4 billion, but they're whistling past the graveyard. Chinese women right now are averaging only 1.3 children. That's lower than even Japan, which is averaging 1.34 children. China is probably already in absolute population decline. Absolute population decline, filling more coffins than cradles each year. Now, officials are hitting the panic button. They've stopped their decades of anti-natal propaganda. I mean, you could, up until a few years ago, walk down the streets in a Chinese town and see signs threatening severe punishment for violating the one-child policy. Signs like, if you give birth to an illegal child, we will tear down your house. They'll tear down your house? Yes, they'll bring in bulldozers and sledgehammers and pickaxes, and they will level your house, and they will take your cattle and livestock, and they will leave you homeless for having an illegal child. They will lock you up for having an illegal child. They will force you to pay heavy fines, and on and on. Those signs have all disappeared, and now we have signs exhorting couples to bear a second, and since last June, a 3rd child, because the 2-child policy didn't work. So last June they said, okay, everybody can have 3 children. And the whole country yawned. They didn't want to have 1, much less 2 or 3. You now see articles published in the state newspapers saying that having a child is not only a family matter, it's also a state affair. It's an affair of state. You have a patriotic obligation to have children. Now, there's a Chinese feminist named Xiaomei Li who's criticized the policy shift. She complains, quote, that women's uteruses are not spigots to be turned on and off at will by the state. Well, the state has been mightily turning that spigot off for most of the last 40 years, and now it's desperately trying to turn the spigot back on. It doesn't work very well when you not only have aborted 400 million babies, but after those abortions, you sterilize those women. You see, because it was a package deal, if you had an illegal child, not only would you lose the child, they would tie your tubes at the same time. So you couldn't have any more children. You see, you were a troublemaker. We're going to take you out of the reproduction business altogether. The state is trying to turn the spigot back on. Local governments have become matchmaking organizations. They set up blind dates. Divorce is being discouraged. 90% of the country's notorious planned birth clinics, those places where they used to take women to be aborted and sterilized and have IUDs inserted against their will, they've been closed down. 90% have been closed down. And yet marriage and birth rates continue to plummet in China for reasons I've talked about. Abortions are now voluntary, but they're running at a staggering 9 million a year, which is only slightly below births. Remember, 10 million births, now we have 9 million abortions. Half of the babies in China conceived are now aborted. Of course, the demographic winter in China is not unique. The demographic winter is not limited to China. Fertility rates around the world are dangerously, dangerously low, according to the World Bank. There's only one continent, or part of a continent, where birth rates are still above replacement, and that is sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason birth rates are still above replacement in sub-Saharan Africa is because infant and child mortality rates are still very high in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you, as a parent, know that your child has a good chance of dying before the age of 5, you have an extra child or two as insurance, you see. Years ago, I met with Bill Gates. Yeah, that Bill Gates, Microsoft Bill Gates. And I tried to convince him that our long-term problem was not too many people, but too few people, and that he should stop pushing population control. And I told him, if you want birth rates in Africa to come down, because he was very worried about too many Africans. He said, if you want birth rates in Africa to come down, don't spend money putting in place population control programs. Spend your money on primary health care. If you can find a cure for malaria, typhus, typhoid, infectious disease, if you can provide clean drinking water to stop dysentery and amoebic dysentery and other intestinal diseases that kill infants, if you can increase the availability of primary health care so that more children survive infancy and childhood, the birth rate will come down naturally. It's called the demographic transition. Birth rates come down, or rather death rates come down, and then birth rates follow, sometimes half a generation, 10, 20 years later. I think it had some effect, because after that he started a big program to develop a cure for malaria. But the rest of the world is dying. I mean, the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, all the developed countries are filling more coffins than cradles, and the rest of the world will soon follow. In the U.S., of course, we have low birth rates. We have below replacement birth rates. You need 2.1 children on average per couple. We have less than that. We've had that less than that for some years now. 64 million abortions since 1973 have thinned the ranks of the young, and of course economically has blasted a gaping hole in Social Security and Medicare, which may not be there when you guys who are young need it. The difference between China and much of the rest of the world, of course, is that communist leaders were not content to let these demographic changes occur naturally as a result of development and urbanization and rising levels of education, all of which reduce birth rates. Instead, they had to force the birth rates down. They were influenced by Western ideas, by the way. Back in 1976, a Chinese engineer by the name of Song Jian, who was a missile specialist, went to the West, and he got a hold of a book published by the Club of Rome about the fact that supposedly we were running out of resources. We were going to run out of chrome and zinc and petroleum and everything else in a decade or two. And the book proposed as a solution population control. He took it back to China and he took it to China's senior leader, who was then a man named Deng Xiaoping. And he said, Vice Premier Deng, the cutting edge of Western science says that overpopulation is the primary threat to economic development. We have to do something. And Vice Premier Deng said, Engineer Song, what should we do? Engineer Song said, we need a radical population control program. We need to reduce China's population to 600 million. How do we do that, Vice Premier Deng said? We need to embark on a one-child policy. So you see, the one-child policy was born out of Western anti-natal, anti-population, anti-people ideas. Of course, it was carried out in the uniquely communist fashion of brutal force. The party embarked on a brutal population control policy that, by forcibly aborting and sterilizing hundreds of millions of women, greatly accelerated China's demographic collapse. Now, Elon Musk texted out something recently. He said, quote, so many people, including smart people, said Elon Musk, think that the population is growing out of control. It's completely the opposite. Please look at the numbers. If people don't have more children, civilization is going to crumble, said Elon Musk in 2021. I wrote in the Wall Street Journal in 1999 that people need to have more children, that overpopulation is a myth, and that if we don't have more children, then civilization, the economy is going to crumble. I don't think Elon Musk had read that article of mine. He came to his conclusions on his own, being a smart guy. But the Chinese leadership has finally looked at the numbers, at the disaster that they've caused, and they're horrified by what it saw. But, you know, the three-child policy, it's too little and too late. I'm very afraid that what's going to happen in China now is that the Chinese government is going to, and when I say the government, I mean the Chinese Communist Party, 92 million members strong, is going to use the same tactics to raise the birth rate that it used to force the birth rate down 40 years ago. They will force women to get pregnant. They will track their menstrual cycles. They did that for decades in China. They had big posters on the walls, on factory walls, with a list of all the women of childbearing age who had not yet been sterilized, and every month they had to put a check mark by their name to publicly swear that they had not conceived a child during that month. They'll do the same thing, only with the idea of getting those women to conceive whether they want to or not. And if that sounds horrific, it is. But if it sounds like something that the Chinese Communist Party would balk at for moral reasons, are you kidding me? There are no questions of ethics or morality here. It's simply a matter of breeding for them. They thinned the herd too much over the last 40 years, and now they need more babies born, and one way or another, they will find a way to turn the spigot back on. So population control is a project that the U.S. government has been involved in since the 1960s. When the overpopulation panic began, we set up the UN Population Fund, by the way. That was a U.S. initiative. We funded it for many years. It was only after we got information out of China about forced abortion, forced sterilization in the 1980s that we were able to cut off funding to the UN Population Fund. We cut it off under Reagan, under Bush 1, Bush 2, and under Trump, and now the money is flowing again. And the UN Population Fund is doing in other countries what I just talked about is happening in China. Vietnam and North Korea and a number of other countries have force-based population control programs. So I should probably bring this talk to a close and see if anyone has any questions. I also just wrote a piece about the Winter Olympics in China, which you can probably imagine I'm not very enthusiastic about. I'm not enthusiastic about it because there is still forced abortion and forced sterilization in China, but not of Han Chinese, of minorities. There is a group, a culture, a nation really of people in the far west of China called the Uyghurs. They are a Turkish-speaking people. They've been in the far west of China, Xinjiang, for a couple thousand years. And women in the Uyghur population are still being forced to have abortions and sterilizations because the Chinese communist leader, Xi Jinping, has decided that they are to be eliminated as a people. The former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, 2 days before leaving office, declared what was happening to the Uyghurs was genocide. Forced abortion and forced sterilization meets the technical definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention. And of course, they're not just forcibly aborting and sterilizing Uyghur women. They're locking up a couple of Uyghur men in concentration camps where they're forced to work 7 days a week, producing goods for export to the United States and other countries. The women and small children are not left alone at home. They bring in police and billet them with the women. They sleep in the same beds. The young children are sent to boarding schools, not allowed to have any contact with their parents. Their father's in prison, of course. Their mother's home with a policeman, Chinese policeman. They're allowed to talk to their mother for half an hour once a month. They're taught in Chinese, so they will never become fluent in their native language of Turkish. And the young people are basically auctioned off in groups of 100 to factories along the coast of China, again, to work producing goods for export to the West and Europe. So that's what's happening to the Uyghurs. When you hear about the Uyghur genocide, when you hear people say that we shouldn't be participating in the Olympics, we should be boycotting the Olympics because of the genocide, that's the genocide that they're talking about. It's a slow-rolling genocide, but it's a genocide nonetheless, and it's intended to eliminate the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs as separate peoples within China. Same thing is being done at a lower level to the Tibetans, to the Mongolians. Their language is being extinguished, their temples are being torn down. Name a human rights abuse in China, and name a human rights abuse, and you will find that it's being practiced in China on a massive scale. So let me end with that. I don't know, David, if we have any time for questions.
Yeah, plenty of time.
All right.
As the questions are asked, could you repeat them for the last
I will repeat the questions. Does anyone have, raise your hand, I'll call on you. Yes, sir.
Maybe more of an observation than a question, but it's interesting that you're here tonight, and we're all thankful that you are here in this past hour, what many of us have never probably heard before completely at one time.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Today is also International Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Yes.
And British and American troops liberated, Auschwitz and Birkenau today. So maybe you're here also for that reason.
Yeah, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We say never again. We will never allow a genocide to occur in real time. So why are the Winter Olympics in China this year when the world knows that genocide is occurring in the far west of that country? The Chinese Communist Party has spent tens of billions of dollars trying to put its best foot forward. The leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, frequently quotes Chairman Mao Zedong, the former leader of China during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And he quotes him saying the Chinese Communist Party has three magic weapons. They are propaganda, they are United Front tactics, and they are the People's Liberation Army. Well, we all know what the People's Liberation Army does. It's a military. What is United Front tactics? Well, that's where you buy, you compromise, you bribe foreign officials and worm your way into foreign organizations and seize control of their messaging and get them to do what you want them to do. And I'm afraid there's been a lot of money and time and propaganda and united front tactics used on the International Olympic Committee to get them to locate the games, the Winter Games in Beijing this year. At a very minimum, we should have moved the games somewhere else. You know, under apartheid, when South Africa was under apartheid, it was barred from participating in the Olympic Games for over 2 decades. China is committing genocide, not to mention every kind of human rights violation under the sun. It should be barred from the Olympic Games as long as the genocide and these other human rights violations continue. It certainly should not have been allowed to host the games. So I think at the end of the day, they basically paid for the games to be held in Beijing. The other thing about the games in Beijing is this. The Olympic Committee is pressing ahead with the games despite the fact that much of Beijing is now in lockdown, and the arriving athletes may be putting themselves at some risk. And not just from COVID-19, if that in fact is what the new outbreak actually is. We don't know why they're locking down their cities. Is it Omicron, which is pronounced I'm a cold because it has very mild symptoms? Is it another more dangerous variant? Is it another pathogen entirely? I mean, I'm hearing rumors out of China about hemorrhagic fevers, but we don't know what it is. The only thing we know is that communist officials are not being honest with us about what's going on in China right now. Why would you lock down a city of 20 million people for a handful of cases, as they claim they have? And if you think back to the origins of COVID-19, remember in the early days, party officials hid the fact that there was an outbreak in Wuhan. They lied about person-to-person transmission. They lied about how infectious it was. And of course, they continue to lie about the origin of it in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Why would they start telling the truth now? So we really don't know. Why would we put our athletes at risk of contracting a new variant? Or even worse, bringing it back to our shores by sending them to Beijing. There are other risks, of course, to our athletes as well. Secretary Mike Pompeo, who's a friend of mine, recently said that he found out that Team USA is telling American athletes not to bring their cell phones to China. If you want a phone, he said, bring a burner phone. Why? Because the Chinese government has created an app that everybody has to download when they enter China's borders. And this app, a Canadian cybersecurity firm found out, has a back door in it allowing the Chinese intelligence services to access all of the information on the smartphone, all of your contacts, all of your financial information, where you've been, who you've talked to, and so forth, and to track you in real time while you're in China. And the icing on the cake is it also has a list, a dictionary, a lexicon of forbidden words. Words like independence and freedom and Taiwan and Xinjiang and Uyghurs, and all of those words are forbidden to be used by this app. So that's why our athletes are being told they should only bring burner phones to China, and they're also warned that they will be tailed, they will be surveilled, they will be monitored constantly by the Chinese security forces. They're also warned that they should not do anything that violates these vague Chinese laws, such as speaking out on human rights abuses or the genocide against the Uyghurs, or they may be arrested and imprisoned. Why would you send your athletes into such a dangerous situation, dangerous to their health, their physical health, dangerous to their, the danger of being arrested and imprisoned? Secretary Pompeo, of course, now regrets not pushing harder to move the Olympics to a free country. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You went to China as an atheist in support of the one-child policy, correct?
Well, the one-child policy was instituted when I was in China, but I was an atheist when I went to China, yes.
Okay. So you've had an incredible conversion. What would you say is the most who has a pro-abortion attitude?
Well, I mean, my conversion was kind of a baptism by fire, because I was in the operating room when they were killing, newborn, unborn children. And I was horrified by the brutality of it. But it was also clear to me, in witnessing the deaths of these nearly full grown babies ready to be born, that we're talking about human beings. We're not talking about a clump of cells. We're not talking about a lump of tissue. We're talking about a human being itself. And as someone with a background in, I have an advanced degree in biology as well, once I saw that, I began trying to draw a line during my life, and before which it would be all right, because whatever we're talking about would not be truly human. And knowing something about biology, I couldn't draw that line, because obviously life begins at conception. So I was drawn inexorably to the conclusion that abortion was wrong at any point in pregnancy. And my conversion, though, kind of occurred in backhanded fashion, because I witnessed the death of these tiny children, and it was as if the pit of hell had opened up before me. You see, up until that time, I had believed, along with many people, supposedly very intelligent people at Stanford, that everything was shades of gray, that morals were relative, that ethics were situational, and there was no absolute good or absolute evil. And yet here I was in this operating room confronted with an absolute evil. And it only seemed reasonable to me that if such an absolute evil could exist as the killing of an innocent child almost at birth, then there must be a compensating good to keep things in balance. Otherwise, the universe would be mad. And I didn't want to live in an insane asylum. And so I began to seek the good that would counterbalance this evil. And of course, all goodness comes from God, and so I was inexorably drawn to the conviction that God existed, and eventually into the Catholic Church as the obvious way that God had communicated with humanity through time. So, yes, ma'am.
How close is the Chinese government, or are they already doing this, by using like forced in vitro upon women? Because you said they look at it as a breeding program. You know, women are no longer mothers. When are they going to just become a vessel to give them more babies? You know.
Help me out with that. I've got the bell ringing in my ear.
The Chinese government forcing like in vitro procedures on women to
Is the Chinese government now beginning to use force, such as in vitro procedures on women, to raise the birth rate? They haven't gotten there yet, but you can see it on the horizon. I say that they're now making in vitro, creating in vitro facilities and making them available to couples. But you see, voluntarism and even propaganda, which is now kicking into high gear, I do not think will raise the birth rate significantly enough to offset the coming demographic collapse. I mean, they've been doing it now since 2016. It's been 6 years of pronatal propaganda, and the birth rate continues to go down. They've also started providing subsidies, small subsidies to couples who have children, lowering the cost of education. But you know, there are only 3 ways to get the birth rate up. The one way is to use the European method, and that is to give people small checks every month for every child they have. In Germany and Austria, it's called Kindergeld. Right? You have a baby, the government gives you an extra $100 a month per baby, something like that. It varies depending on where you are. But of course, the government at the same time is taking, in Europe, with high taxes, 60% of your income, and then giving you a pittance back and saying you can raise a child on that $100 a month, and that hasn't had very much effect on the birth rate. It's only bumped it up slightly. The next approach, of course, is what we have tried to do in this country. We have a child tax credit, which means that, you know, if you have a child between, well, under the age of 16, you get a credit against your taxes. But that hasn't sufficed in terms of raising the birth rate to 2.1 either. So I think we need to go much further. I think we need a kind of Marshall Plan to get the birth rate up in this country. What we should do is we should shelter young couples who are willing to marry and have children from all taxes. And maybe it would work like this. With the first child, your taxes would be cut by 1/3, including Social Security taxes. With the second child by 2/3, and anyone with 3 children or more would pay nothing in taxes. And if you did that, you would be moving in the direction of fairness, because couples with children are actually taxed twice, in the sense that they have to pay taxes to the government. They're also bearing the costs of raising children, who are future taxpayers, right? They're providing for the future of the country in the most fundamental way by providing the next generation. And so they ought to be sheltered from taxes in order that they can have the resources to do that, which ultimately benefits the rest of us in the community. So that's what needs to happen, and I think if we did that, then the birth rate would rise naturally to replacement or beyond. Because the fact of the matter is, there will always be people who choose not to have children. And they should be free, couples should be free to decide for themselves the number and spacing of their children. They haven't been in China. But there have also always been young couples, young women who want to have more children than they wind up having, but find the financial burden to be unbearable. The last survey I saw showed that young women on average expressed an interest for 2.5 children. You don't have half a child, of course, that's an average. But and they actually only average now 1.7. So there is a lot of frustrated fertility in the United States, and we need to enable young couples to act on their fertility desires and have the number of children that they want. And if only a quarter or a third of the population has 3 or 4 children, then they will offset those who choose to have 1 or 2 or none. And things would stabilize over the long run. And an Elon Musk civilizational collapse would be avoided. But that's what has to happen. It has to be a much more serious pronatal program. In China, they're going to move, I'm afraid, to coercion. It's going to be the Handmaid's Tale come to life in China before they're done, because they will either raise children in test tubes, they will do forced pregnancies, they will get the birth rate up because they've thinned the herd too much, and they've decided they need to build up the herd. And these are not people with any moral grounding whatsoever. They're pure utilitarians. Yes, sir, in the back.
I've read in China that the population has been moving from the rural areas to the urban areas. Is that true?
Yeah.
And based on their issues you described, at some point, where does that day of reckoning come for the Chinese that Nebraska's got the lowest unemployment rate in the country? So we can relate to this. Where are the workers going to come from in China?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a worker shortage, which has temporarily, of course, been gone away because of the economic dislocation of the ongoing pandemic. But yeah, there has been a huge rural-urban migration in China, which is now drawing to a close. China is a resource-poor country. It can barely feed itself. It has to import food, massive amounts of food each year, in order to feed its population. Now, I write in Bully of Asia about China's dream. And the dream of China, that is to say the dream of the new Red Emperor Xi Jinping and the senior leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, who believe their dreams are the only dreams that matter. Their dream is to create a China which is the industrial base of the entire world. That is, it'll be the factory floor of the entire world, producing all of the goods that the rest of us consume. Now that means the rest of the world will have three roles. They will have the role of providing food to feed China's workforce. They will have the role of providing raw materials to feed China's factories, and they will have the role of being passive consumers, sheep-like consumers of the products that come from China. That's the world of the future that China envisions. That is a world in which China would be absolutely dominant economically, and it's not a family that, it's not a world that you and or your children or grandchildren want to live in.
One final question.
I guess trailing his question, it seems like for economic reasons, the U.S. corporations are kind of turning their back on human conditions in China, or not aware of the conditions there. I mean, it seems like Nike or some of these companies do.
Yeah. American corporations have largely ignored human rights abuses in China. We did call out Nike last year because Nike was using the Uyghur young people that I talked about, the ones who were being sold in cohorts of 100 as slave labor to coastal factories in China. A Nike supplier was using 800 Uyghur young people. These are young people 16 to 25, unmarried, who are kept in factory compounds under guard, forced to work 6.5 days a week, let out only on Sunday afternoon for a couple hours, under guard so they won't run away, and forced to work long hours during the day, and then in the evening they're forced to attend propaganda and language lessons so they become forcibly assimilated into the greater Han Chinese population. When we found out that Nike was using slave labor to produce its goods, Nike canceled the contract. But there's a lot of that going on, and it's very, very hard to trace. Things are, products can be produced in one place and then labeled as being produced in another. They can be transshipped through another country. They can be transshipped through Hong Kong and repackaged. So it's very hard to trace back, trace it back to slave labor. But there is a lot of that in China. And in fact, it has been illegal to import goods made with slave labor since the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act back in the early 1930s, because the Smoot-Hawley tariffs included a provision intended to ban slave labor in the Soviet Union from being used to produce goods to be exported to the United States. So over the years, we've been able to identify at the Population Research Institute some products that were produced by slave labor. You bring it to the attention of customs, and those products will be interdicted and seized. But it's very, very hard to keep track of. Very, very hard. But American companies, I think, by and large, are becoming much more realistic about the situation in China, because so many of our Fortune 500 companies were attracted to go into China by the promise of market access, market share. They were promised huge profits in the China market, the largest market in the world. And once they got into China, they found that their technology was stolen, that competing companies supported by the Communist Party and its officials were set up next door, and the same goods they were producing were being produced in those competing factories, and they were out-competed and squeezed. So they were squeezed dry of their technology and then squeezed back out of China. There have been some exceptions, of course, like Apple, which has a secret deal with the Chinese Communist Party officials. It's managed to sell quite a few iPhones in China. But a lot of other Chinese, rather Fortune 500 companies have found that the China market is not nearly as lucrative as they thought it was, or they were promised it was. The fact is that, China is essentially a lawless country. It's not a country with the rule of law. It's not a country that abides by contract law. It's whatever the local official in charge says from day to day. That's what applies. That's what dictates behavior. And when you sign a contract with a Chinese firm, there will be an English version and a Chinese version. And the English version may say exactly what you want it to say, but the Chinese version is the one that is definitive, is operative. And if you come into conflict with your Chinese partner, the Chinese version is the one that will be read and interpreted by the courts, and it will almost invariably be read and interpreted in a way that serves the interests of the Chinese side and not the American side. So lots and lots of games are played in China.
Where can we learn more and get copies of your book?
Well, my website is, our website at the Population Research Institute is easy, pop.org, pop.org. POP is short for Population Research Institute. By the way, I talked a lot about being generous with having children. My wife and I have 8, so we've done our duty. Grandchildren, how many?
Number 10 on the way.
Number 10 on the way. So we're into double digits in grandchildren, but
And we still have 4 that are not in production.
that's right. We still have 4 not. So, as far as getting the book, the paperback edition of Bully of Asia, newly updated, just came out yesterday, and I have a few copies with me. If anyone would like to get a copy, I'll be happy to sign it. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to everyone who's watching online now and in the future.